This video is for Unit 2.1 on communities. So a community is a group of organisms of different species that live in the same area. So let's write that down first as a reminder. Again, it's a group of different species living and interacting in the same habitat. Now, we've been talking about ecosystems for a while here, and the ecosystem is that habitat perhaps that these organisms are interacting in. So now we're zooming down in a little bit further into those actual living organisms that are in those ecosystems or in those habitats. So within a community, there are a lot of ways that the organisms can interact with each other. And in this case, what we're going to be talking about is these interspecific interactions. This means between species. So we're not discussing interactions amongst a group of a population. So for example, you can see down here we have a bunch of walruses. We're not talking about the relationships between the walruses, but instead the relationships between this Arctic fox and this group of walruses. That's between different species. So these interspecific interactions are between species in a community. And again, it's these different species that we're looking at. Now there are a few different types that we're going to be talking about in this video. For each different type, you're going to see this kind of symbol after the name. And what that symbol represents is what happens to the organisms that are involved in the relationship. Are they benefited? That would be a plus. Are they hurt? That would be a minus. Or is there no effect on that organism? That would be a 0. So the first way that organisms can interact with each other, or the first interspecific interaction, is predation. This is your good old-fashioned predator-prey relationships. And this is definitely a positive-negative relationship, because one of the organisms in the group, the predator, is a plus, right? And the other organism, the prey, is a minus. The predator is being benefited, it's getting energy from the relationship. The prey is losing energy from the relationship. Now, typical predator-prey relationships we think about are like this lion and zebra. Something attacks something else and kills it. But in reality, there are a lot of different predator-prey relationships. Some other examples include herbivory. So this would be like eating plants, because this is two different species. One is helped, right, or the positive, that would be the plant eater. So like a mouse perhaps. And the other is hurt, that would be the plant itself. So maybe the corn that the mouse is eating. Another example that many people don't think about as herbivory is as predation is parasitism. I gotta make sure I spell this right. Parasitism. Okay, you guys have heard of a parasite and a host relationship. Probably the most common one that people think of is like a tapeworm living inside a host, or maybe a flea or a tick living on a mammal. Okay, in this relationship, again, the parasite is benefited, that's the plus, and the host is not benefited or is hurt, that's the minus. Even though the host doesn't die, it still is a negative effect on that host. All right, the next example of an interspecific relationship is something called mutualism. And as you can see up here, this is a plus-plus relationship. That means it benefits both species. All right, so let's give some examples of this, because this one might be a little more unusual than the predator-prey. One of the most common examples of this is pollination, like we see what's going on here. In pollination, we usually have a flower, which is benefited because its pollen is spread around, so its reproductive material is spread from flower to flower. And we usually have a pollinator. Now that pollinator is being benefited because it is getting nectar or sugar from the flower. The pollinator could be a wasp or a bee, as shown here. Could be even a moth or a bird. So there are a lot of different types of pollinators, but they all benefit the flowers they pollinate, and the pollinator itself is also benefited. So that's probably the most common example of mutualism. Other examples I have here, this one over here on the old log or tree stump is an example of something called lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N. We see this all over the place, even though you probably don't realize it. It's any like green kind of crusty stuff you might see growing on a tree or sometimes on garage doors or things like that. And what lichen actually is actually a fungus and an algae living together. And they help each other. The algae goes through photosynthesis to make sugar for the fungus, and the fungus helps with water regulation for the algae. So again, it's a plus-plus relationship. This one down here at the bottom that you can see below the lichen, that one a lot of people are familiar with. That's a clownfish and a sea anemone. They both benefit each other. The sea anemone gets cleaned by the clownfish, and the clownfish gets food and protection from the anemone. And then the last one down here at the bottom is supposed to represent the bacteria that live in your digestive tract. You actually have a lot of really good bacteria living inside you that help you digest your food, and you help them by providing food for them. So that's a mutualistic relationship. The third type of relationship is called commensalism. So you can see up here at the top, it's a positive neutral relationship. So one organism benefits, the other is neither harmed nor helped. And that would be called neutral. So it doesn't hurt the organism, but it doesn't help it out either. Okay, a very common example of this is the one smack down in the middle here. You can see it as these white crusty things. What these actually are, right here, are barnacles. So they're like kind of little shelled creatures, they're crustaceans that attach themselves to a variety of surfaces. And in this case, these barnacles are attached to a whale. Now they don't hurt the whale, but they don't help the whale either. So the whale is the zero or the neutral part of this relationship. The barnacles are the plus part. And why are they a plus? Why are they benefited? Well, these barnacles are filter feeders. And so they need moving water in order to get particles out of the water. And so by attaching to a whale, which is a moving source, they are able to get lots of filtered water through them for feeding. Another common example is down here is our hermit crab. The hermit crab is benefited by picking up the shells of other organisms. Those other organisms are dead, so it doesn't hurt them if the hermit crab uses the shell as a home. The hermit crab is benefited because it gets the shell. Over here, I wanted to give you a plant example. This is an orchid. Orchids are something called bryophytes, so they live on other trees, for example, so they'll attach right to the side of a tree. They are not hurting the tree in any way, but they need the support and the structure of the tree, especially the trees are really high up to get enough oxygen and light and things like that in the rainforest. And the last one is one you've maybe seen before. This is a shark, which has a creature called a remora attached to it. Here's the remora right down here at the bottom. Remoras have like a suction cup on the tops of their bodies, and they attach themselves to the bottom of the shark. They get little food scraps and things that the shark leaves behind when it's feeding. So the remora is benefited in this relationship. The shark isn't hurt by having this little hitchhiker come along with it. So the effect on the shark itself is neutral. It doesn't help the shark, it doesn't hurt the shark. Okay, so before we move on to the last type of relationship, I want to introduce a new word for you. So all of these things that we've talked about so far, most of them anyway, are parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So remember, parasitism was a type of predation. Mutualism was that plus-plus relationship. Commensalism was the the plus-neutral relationship. These all fit into a special category of close relationship. So when the organisms live right next to each other, or in some cases right on top of each other, that is called something that maybe you've heard before. It's called symbiosis. Okay, and let's look at the root words of this. Bio is living. Sim means together. So parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism are a special type of community relationship called symbiosis because those organisms live so close together. This would be different from the organisms like the predator-prey relationships, like a lion and a zebra, because they don't really live on top of each other or close to each other. But parasites, mutualistic organisms, and commensalistic organisms do live right next to each other. All right, our last type of organism relationship within a community is competition. And competition is that negative relationship, as you can see right up here. Okay, and what does that negative mean? That means that both organisms are hurt by the relationship. And by hurt, it means they don't fare as well as they would if they didn't have competition. Now, this tends to be the most confusing one for students because people think of competition as having a winner and a loser. Like if you play a football game, you have a competition, one team wins and one team loses. But in nature, in competition, there is no winner and loser. Both organisms technically are hurt by being in the competition. So let me give you a better example of this. When resources are low, so for example, if we're talking about these organisms down here, starlings and native songbirds. So starlings are these kind of blackbird-looking things. Native songbirds would be like goldfinches or cardinals or something like that. When their resources are low, so when there's not a lot of space for them or not a lot of food for them, they compete with each other for those resources. Okay, so if we've got our resources, I'm just going to put little F's for food. Okay, there's our resources. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 resources. And over here on the left, we've got our native songbird. Put N for native. And over here on the right, we have our starling. Put S for starling. They have to fight it out for those 7 resources. So the native songbird maybe gets 3 of those resources. And the starling maybe gets 3 of those resources because they're competing for the same food. Now let's look at what would happen if we didn't have to worry about one of those organisms, if there was no competition. In other words, let's say there are no starlings. So I'm going to take the starlings out of the picture. Okay, we still have the same amount of resources. Okay, so we have 7 food items. 5, 6, 7. But there's no starlings there to compete with. So the native birds get all of the food resources when there's no competition. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. If there's no competition, the native songbirds are better off. If there is competition, both the starlings and the native songbirds get less food than they would if they were just alone. And again, this gets at its worst point when resources are low. If we have lots of food to share, it's not a big deal. But if there's only a little bit of food to split between the different species, then competition becomes a real issue. All right, that's all on communities and interspecific relationships for now. Remember to fill out the form that goes along with this video after you finish up your notes.